Okay, so when we did the previous pivot, we went all the way back and we loaded the data, made a summary, and then took that summary and created a pivot. Well, maybe we could go back to the original data frame. The one with the 13 million records, and create a pivot table from that. This would eliminate all that aggregation. We just went through, including eliminating the indices. All right, so let's try it. Let's create pivot 2. Okay, make sure we can see it well. So let's create pivot 2, and again, I'm going to have to put in we're going to run this as a cell because this is a multi-line piece of code. Okay, so let's create pivot 2. And instead of df summary, we're going to just go back to the original df. Remember, the original data frame is 13.5 million records, all 14 variables. So we're going to go df dot pivot table as the function. And we're going to put in, well, what do we use here? We want the index to be brand. So let's use index equals brand. We want the columns to equal store, just like we did up here. We want the values. Well, what do we want the values to be? So let's think about that. We want the values to be sales dollars. But remember, before it was sales dollars, we already did the aggregation. We already came up with a mean. So we're going to have to come up with another thing in here. And you can see, I'm just kind of looking to see, you can see in our description here, values, index, right? We're on values. We can also put in an ag function, mean. You see this description here. So let's put in the values equals sales dollars. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to put this on a separate line just so it's not going over sales dollars. Okay. And now we'll put in an ag function. And that ag function will have equal mean. If we wanted more ag functions, we could do mean, sum, standard deviation. But let's just keep it mean just to show the comparison. Margins. Let's see what this looks like. Margins equals, right? In this case, I'm going to say true. And you might want to play with that and say, okay, well, what happens when I say margins equals false? What does it look like? And then fill value, I still like that. And I'm going to put in nothing in there, just a blank, okay? So all of this makes sense. I'm not I'd experiment a little bit to see what margins true, margins false looks like. Well, let's run it with true, and then I'll run it again with false. Let's run this cell. All right, it's working. And let's see what we get out of pivot 2. Okay, so pivot 2, pivot 1, data frame, good. 14,457, 14,458, 78, 70. Something's going on here. Well, take a look at pivot 2. I just want to run it one more time, just with false. And I'm going to just name this one pivot 3. Because I want to see if there's a difference. Oh, I got to run the cell. That's what happens. Got to run the cell. Okay, pivot 3. pivot 3 looks more like pivot. Interesting. I'm not really sure what's going. Well, let's take a look. Let's take a look at pivot, pivot 2, and pivot 3. So let's take a look at pivot 2. I'm not going to go all the way down to the 14,000. I'm going to see why is there an extra column in pivot 2. So let's see what that extra column is. Let's go all the way to the end. Oh, it has all. So that's something that's a little bit different. So if I look at pivot, which was the one we used from the aggregation standpoint, and we go all the way to the end, it's just goes to the end, right? It just goes to the last store, 84. Okay, so let's see what margins false means. What's pivot 3 mean? Let's see, pivot 3. Let's go all the way to the end. So basically, with margins false, I'm not having, and what the 14,458th element is, that's the row totals. Okay, that's the provide row totals versus pivot or pivot 3 with margins being false. Okay, so what I'm gonna do is I want to copy this and also put this in here into the script so you see both. And the only difference here is margins false, margins. I'm going to make this margins true and margins false, and you can see the comparison. The only difference in that margin seems to be that it's adding the total. So just to make a few comments on what we just did, the one difference in the two methods, and the methods we're talking about is taking it from this aggregation summary and doing that pivot. In the two methods, and this is, I'm going to just put in here between pivot and pivot 2, is pivot 2 with margins equals true provides row and column totals versus pivot or pivot 3. Pivot 3 is the one where it's false for margins. Okay? And if you look at the shape, you can see there's that extra row, extra column in pivot 2. And that's an indication that something happened here. And so as you move from one thing to the next, always make sure that if you expect your data to have a certain shape and then you do something to it and it has a completely different shape or it's added values, make sure that the code hasn't done something to your original data. If you recall, when we were doing merges, that became a problem where I had doubles in my price file and it expanded how much I had in sales dollars. All right. So again, recap of this. If you look at the shape of the two data sets, data frames, again, that's pivot and pivot 2. You will see that pivot 2 has an extra row and extra column. Okay, extra row and an extra column. All right. Now, this mean. What is this mean actually calculating? It's a cautionary tale, and we'll get to that in the next video, in part 3 of this particular little video series on looking at pivot tables.